The year is 67 AD, and something unsettling haunts the marble corridors of the imperial palace in Rome. Servants whisper in hushed tones about their emperor's strange new companion, a figure who glides through the shadows wearing silk and jewels that once belonged to a woman now dead. But the most chilling part isn't what you can see. It's what you can sense lurking beneath the surface, a darkness so profound it makes even the bravest Romans avert their eyes. If you're fascinated by the hidden mysteries of ancient history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Today's story will take you into the twisted mind of one of history's most notorious rulers and reveal how grief can transform into something far more sinister than anyone could imagine. Emperor Nero wasn't always the monster history remembers. When he first took power at just 16 years old, many Romans believed they were witnessing the birth of a golden age. He lowered taxes, funded magnificent public spectacles, and even performed on stage, delighting crowds with his artistic talents. But power has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls, and by his 10th year as emperor, something fundamental had shattered inside Nero's psyche. The catalyst for this transformation was a woman named Poppaea Sabina. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic in a way that seemed almost supernatural. When she entered a room, conversations stopped. When she spoke, even the most powerful senators listened. Poppaea possessed an intelligence that matched her beauty and an ambition that knew no bounds. Nero's obsession with Poppaea began as a typical Roman scandal. He was already married to Octavia, a quiet and dutiful wife chosen for political reasons. But Poppaea represented everything Octavia wasn't. Where Octavia sought to avoid attention, Poppaea commanded it effortlessly. Where Octavia accepted her role with resignation, Poppaea wielded her influence like a weapon. What started as an affair quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. Nero didn't just desire Poppaea, he was consumed by her. Ancient historians describe his behavior during this period as increasingly erratic and possessive. He would station guards around her constantly, ostensibly for protection, but really to monitor her every interaction. He showered her with gifts that drained the imperial treasury, jewels from distant lands, silks that cost more than most Romans earned in a lifetime. Most tellingly, Nero began reshaping reality itself to accommodate his obsession. He divorced Octavia in a move that shocked even his closest advisors, then married Poppaea in a ceremony of unprecedented extravagance. But even marriage couldn't satisfy his need to possess her completely. Nero commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures of Poppaea, not just for public display, but for his private chambers. He would spend hours simply watching her go about her daily activities, studying her movements like a predator observing prey. This wasn't romantic devotion. This was the behavior of someone who had confused love with ownership. Poppaea, for her part, seemed to understand the dangerous game she was playing. She was intelligent enough to recognize that her beauty gave her unprecedented power, but shrewd enough to realize this power came with enormous risks. She used her influence to advance her family's interests and build a network of supporters who might protect her if Nero's affections ever wavered. But Poppaea had one fatal characteristic that would ultimately seal her fate. Unlike everyone else in the imperial court, she wasn't afraid to stand up to Nero. She would argue with him about policy decisions, criticize his artistic pursuits, and even mock his performances when she thought they were lacking. In a world where contradicting the emperor could mean instant execution, Poppaea's independence was both thrilling and terrifying. The details of what happened on that fateful day in 65 AD vary depending on which ancient source you consult, but the outcome was always the same. During what started as a typical domestic argument, Nero lost control in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his life. According to some accounts, the argument began when Poppaea criticized Nero's priorities, suggesting he cared more about his public image than his responsibilities as a husband. She was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child, and perhaps the stress made her less willing to tolerate his increasingly erratic behavior. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries, but most agree that Nero, in a fit of uncontrolled rage, struck his pregnant wife with such force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. The exact nature of the assault remains unclear, but the result was undeniable. Poppaea collapsed, bleeding internally, and despite the best efforts of Rome's finest physicians, she perished within hours. Imagine the moment when Nero realized what he had done. The man who commanded 30 legions, who could execute anyone with a word, who was worshipped as a god in distant provinces, had just destroyed the one thing he actually treasured. Ancient sources describe the scene that followed as one of the most pathetic in imperial history. Nero threw himself upon Poppaea's lifeless form, alternately begging for her forgiveness and commanding her to return to life, as if his imperial authority extended even over death itself. He summoned every physician in Rome, offering them fortunes beyond imagination to save her, threatening them with unspeakable torments if they failed. But it was too late. In that moment, something fundamental broke inside the emperor's mind. The grief that followed wasn't just emotional devastation, it was a complete break with reality. Nero's mourning became legendary throughout the empire. He refused to have Poppaea's body cremated according to Roman custom, instead having it embalmed and placed in a tomb more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He declared her a goddess, established a religious cult in her honor, and spent days speaking to her corpse as if she could still hear him. The imperial court now had to navigate an even more treacherous landscape, with courtiers expected to participate in the elaborate fiction that Poppaea was somehow still alive. It was during this period of madness that a young man named Sporus first caught the emperor's attention. Sporus was probably around 15 years old, born into slavery, but freed as a child and raised within the palace walls. This was actually a position of relative privilege in the Roman world, but it came with complete dependence on imperial favor. What made Sporus special in Nero's fractured mind wasn't his intelligence or administrative skills. It was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree that the young man bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Poppaea, particularly around the eyes and delicate bone structure. In a world where physical resemblance was believed to indicate deeper spiritual connections, this similarity would have seemed almost supernatural. The first time Nero saw Sporus after Poppaea's demise, something clicked in the emperor's broken psyche. Here was a chance to undo the irreversible, to bring back what he had destroyed through his own violence. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment, Nero may have actually believed he was seeing Poppaea's spirit returned in a new form. Of course, there was one obvious obstacle. Sporus was male. But for a man who had convinced himself he was divine, who had spent months conversing with a corpse, altering someone's gender seemed like a minor challenge. What happened next represents one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in recorded human history. Nero didn't simply decide to force Sporus to dress as a woman for entertainment. He decided to make the transformation permanent and complete. The emperor summoned Rome's most skilled physicians and ordered them to perform surgical procedures on the young man, operations designed solely to make him appear more feminine. This wasn't just mutilation, it was the systematic destruction of Sporus's identity as a human being. The surgery was dangerous, agonizing, and irreversible. Ancient medical procedures were primitive, relying on basic instruments and crude pain relief. The process would have been excruciating, lasting hours with significant risk of death from infection or blood loss. Even if Sporus survived, he would be forever changed physically, emotionally, and socially. Once Sporus had recovered, a process that took months, Nero announced something that shocked even the jaded Roman aristocracy. He was going to marry the young man in a full imperial wedding ceremony. The preparations consumed enormous resources and took months to complete. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress, and moved to luxurious quarters where he could be prepared for his new role. Imperial seamstresses created an entire wardrobe designed to flatter his modified physique and conceal any remaining masculine characteristics. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him, many incorporating gems that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These weren't just accessories, they were tangible links to the dead woman, physical reminders of the person Sporus was being forced to replace. Makeup artists taught him cosmetic techniques to feminize his features, showing him how to use kohl to make his eyes appear larger, how how to apply rouge for rosy cheeks, how to use powders to soften angular facial features. These lessons weren't just about appearance, they were exercises in the systematic erasure of his original identity. Hairdressers instructed him in elaborate styling techniques, fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. His hair was cut, curled, and arranged in complex patterns, often incorporating expensive ornaments. The process could take hours daily, requiring multiple servants and heated metal tools. But perhaps most psychologically damaging were the lessons in feminine behavior and deportment. Sporus was assigned tutors who taught him how to walk, sit, and gesture in appropriately ladylike ways. He learned how to position his hands, arrange his feet, and move through space while conveying grace rather than masculine strength. Voice coaches worked with him to modify his speech patterns, teaching him to speak in higher tones and adopt linguistic mannerisms associated with feminine discourse. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect, as vocal patterns are deeply ingrained habits that are extremely difficult to change consciously. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this transformation? Every day, Sporus was forced to look in mirrors that reflected back a stranger wearing his face. Every lesson in feminine behavior reminded him that his identity was being systematically erased. Every piece of jewelry that had once adorned a dead woman was now a shackle binding him to a role he never chose. The wedding was scheduled for spring of 67 AD, timed to coincide with religious festivals that would add ceremonial weight to the occasion. Nero spared no expense, treating it as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. The ceremony took place in the largest palace hall, decorated with imported flowers and illuminated by thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding songs, while servants offered the finest wines and most exotic delicacies available in the empire. To outside observers who didn't know the full story, it might have appeared to be a normal imperial wedding. But those in the know understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and deeply disturbing. Here was the most powerful man in the world publicly marrying a surgically modified teenager dressed as his deceased wife. The ceremony included all traditional Roman wedding rituals. They exchanged vows, joined hands, shared sacred bread, and signed legal documents that made their union official in the eyes of Roman law. The guests played their parts with accomplished acting skills, offering congratulations and expensive gifts, while maintaining expressions of appropriate joy. But the atmosphere must have been thick with barely concealed horror and the nervous energy that comes from participating in something fundamentally wrong. Following the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would any legitimate empress. The young man received his own household staff, luxurious quarters within the palace complex, and a substantial income from the imperial treasury. He had his own litter for traveling, fine horses for riding, and a retinue of supporters befitting his new status. But all this apparent luxury came with a terrible price: the complete erasure of his original identity and constant performance of a psychologically devastating role. Sporus was expected to accompany Nero to public functions, sit beside him at state dinners, and play the devoted wife in all social interactions. This wasn't just about maintaining appearances. Nero genuinely seemed to believe he had successfully resurrected Poppaea. He would call Sporus by his dead wife's name, reminisce about shared memories that had never actually happened, and expect responses that maintained this elaborate fiction. For Sporus, every day became a high-stakes performance where the slightest mistake could mean execution. He had to remember not just how to look and act like a woman, but how to respond as if he were Poppaea herself. When Nero mentioned events from his previous marriage, Sporus had to react as if he remembered them personally, despite never having experienced them. Ancient sources describe Sporus as becoming increasingly skilled at this deception, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods and respond appropriately. But they also note that he grew more withdrawn and melancholic as time passed, even as he continued playing his assigned role perfectly in public. The psychological strain is almost impossible to comprehend. Every morning, Sporus woke in rooms decorated to remind him of a dead woman he had never met. Every mirror reflection showed a face that bore no resemblance to his original appearance. Every conversation required pretending to be someone else, claiming memories and experiences that weren't his own. For over 2 years, Sporus lived this bizarre existence. But his ordeal reached new heights when Nero decided to tour Greece. The emperor fancied himself an artist and was eager to compete in Greek festivals, where he believed his talents would be properly appreciated. Naturally, Sporus accompanied him, displayed to foreign dignitaries as the Empress of Rome. Imagine Greek aristocrats trying to make sense of their Roman conqueror, traveling with a teenage boy dressed as a woman, demanding that everyone treat this obvious fiction as reality. But by 68 AD, Nero's excesses had finally pushed the Roman establishment beyond their breaking point. Rebellions erupted across the empire, led by governors who had grown tired of the emperor's erratic behavior and complete neglect of actual governance. The Praetorian Guard declared their opposition to Nero's continued rule, and the Senate officially condemned him as an enemy of the state. When Nero finally fled Rome with a small group of loyal supporters, Sporus was among them. Even facing potential capture and execution, the emperor couldn't leave behind his living reminder of Poppaea. They took refuge in a villa outside Rome, waiting for either rescue or capture, while Nero alternated between grandiose escape plans and theatrical preparations for suicide. When word arrived that his enemies were closing in, Nero finally chose death over the humiliation of capture. But his suicide left Sporus in an incredibly vulnerable position. As one of the most visible symbols of Nero's reign, he was both a valuable prize and a dangerous liability for whoever claimed power next. What followed was perhaps even more tragic than what had come before. Sporus became a political pawn, passed from one powerful man to another like valuable property. He was first claimed by Nidius Sabinus, then by Otho, then by Vitellius, each treating him much as Nero had, keeping him dressed as a woman and calling him by Poppaea's name. It was under Vitellius that Sporus's nightmare reached its ultimate conclusion. The new emperor decided to use him for public entertainment in the Colosseum, specifically in reenactments of mythological scenes that would involve violence and humiliation. For Sporus, this represented the ultimate degradation, being sexually humiliated in front of thousands of spectators for their amusement. Rather than submit to this final indignity, Sporus made the only choice that had been truly his own in years. He ended his own life, probably by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was likely no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally escaped the grotesque theater that had consumed his existence. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of imperial excess. But ancient historians seemed less interested in Sporus as a person than as a symbol of imperial decadence. What makes his story so haunting isn't just the abuse he endured, but how he was systematically stripped of identity and agency. From the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual and became instead a canvas for the emperor's twisted fantasies. The fact that Sporus chose death over further humiliation suggests that somewhere beneath the layers of forced femininity and imperial conditioning, some spark of his original self had survived. His suicide was both tragedy and final act of defiance, a refusal to be degraded further, even at the cost of his life. Perhaps most tragically, we know almost nothing about who Sporus was before his transformation. What were his hopes and dreams? What did he want to do with his life? All of that was erased when he became Nero's living doll, replaced by a performance so complete that his original identity disappeared entirely. This is the story of the boy who was forced to become an empress, who endured years of psychological and physical abuse, and who finally chose death over further degradation. His tale deserves to be remembered not just as a curiosity from ancient Rome, but as a testament to both human cruelty and human resilience. In choosing his own death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing that had been denied him throughout his adult life: the power to make his own choice about his fate. His story reminds us that behind every historical narrative of imperial grandeur, there are individual human stories of suffering and survival that deserve our attention and compassion, even across the vast gulf of 2,000 years. The shadows that haunted the marble corridors of Nero's palace weren't supernatural. They were the echoes of a young man's stolen life, a reminder that absolute power doesn't just corrupt those who wield it, but destroys those who cannot escape its reach. If this story has moved you, please share it with others who appreciate the hidden truths of history. Subscribe for more forgotten tales that reveal the human cost of power and ambition. And remember, the most important stories are often the ones that make us uncomfortable, because they force us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature that we must never allow to repeat.